Hey, it's the procrastinating professor here. And today we have something a little bit different. I'm joined here by Gaddafi, a Singaporean Kings of War community leader, event organizer, and really a game hype man. So welcome to the channel.
Hi, thanks, Professor. It's my pleasure to be here.
You're technically my first guest and collaborator, actually. So thank you for coming. For a channel that I was thinking of doing more painting, it's like, yeah, why don't we just have a game-based collab as my first video?
Awesome.
Yeah, fantastic. So perhaps for starters, you could just kindly introduce yourself to our viewers.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Gaddafi. I'm known as the General Gaddafi online and within the Kings of War community. I am in my mid-30s. I am from Singapore. For those of you who don't know, Singapore is a tiny red dot about 50 km across, somewhere in Southeast Asia along the equator. So I've been playing Kings of War quite regularly since the start of second edition, which was back, I think, in 2016, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been wargaming pretty much for about 20 years now. Started with, as many of you may have, started with Warhammer Fantasy. That was back in the early 90s. Yeah, but we didn't really play much then because, I was like a kid, like 7, 8 years old. So it was me and my best buddy painting miniatures, playing with toy soldiers, but not exactly playing the game. Yeah.
Understandable. I think many of us started with that. I started with 40k, but I did play fantasy starting in I think 6th edition, if I recall correctly. It was the edition where for Christmas, I think in 1998, I'm like dating myself, right? But for Christmas in 1998, they gave like a free either a Orc Wyvern or a Empire Griffin as part of their Christmas deal. But you had to pick one or the other. You didn't get both in the same box.
Okay.
So yeah, I picked up fantasy around then. I just realized I actually have never done an introduction for myself on my own channel. But
yeah, you should. You should.
That's the irony of the whole situation. But yeah, I mean, for me, of course, as you know, I just picked up Kings of War. I kind of got interested in it about a year or two ago, but because of the pandemic, we just obviously never got a chance to play it. And of course, a few months ago, I posted on I think it was the international group.
Yep.
Yeah, you saw my post and immediately started messaging me and adding me to Facebook and whatnot. I was like, wow, that's some passion down there. But it's great. It's very, very good to have someone that passionate about a game.
Yeah, because Kings of War has a main page, Kings of War Fanatics, with about 12,000 members. So I'm always on the lookout for people from Asia. So just by stalking them, I actually have actually found a community in Malaysia and in Indonesia, in Bali. One of my closest friends is a Kings of War player in Bali. Believe it or not, can share it later.
That's fantastic. I mean, playing in basically a holiday resort getaway location.
Yes.
I mean, it's a very interesting situation because usually when we start a new game, right? If let's say, for example, the community is extremely small or non-existent, it's very easy for people to kind of lose interest and move on to another game. So I think having someone like you where you're willing to kind of reach out to people from different countries like myself, I think that's really helpful. And of course, behind the scenes, I've asked you many questions and you've even checked on me about how my games are progressing, how my hobby is progressing, which is fantastic. I mean, I wish more people like you existed in other communities as well, because I think it would be so much easier to grow from there. So
I feel the main appeal of war gaming and tabletop gaming is the community. It's playing with someone live over the table. I think the interaction, the fun, the banter, it's the game. Yes, we all love to win, but winning and losing isn't really the main aim. It's just to have fun. So if you have playing with a friend, it's definitely fun.
Yeah, I agree with that. Over the lockdown period, of course, some of my friends got into like what's it called again? The virtual tabletop thing.
There's Universal Battle, which is the 2D version, and also there's also TTS, Tabletop Simulator.
Tabletop Simulator, right?
Yeah.
And I tried, and of course the program is very good. Some of the community made mods are incredible.
Yep.
But somehow it was missing that element of the human interaction aspect, which I guess before we get too far into the video, it's probably worth actually explaining what Kings of War is.
Yes, so for those who might not know, Kings of War is a rank and flank mass battle fantasy game. It's probably closest to Warhammer Fantasy if you have ever played Warhammer Fantasy. So basically, you are a general, you pick your forces, you feel an army, and you just go to battle. And unlike Warhammer Fantasy, which didn't really have much in the way of scenarios, there's 12 core scenarios in the Kings of War rulebook. So it's not just about killing your opponent, it's about controlling the area or controlling objectives or getting a token or over a line or capturing objectives. So it's a miniature agnostic game. So you can use any miniature whatsoever. You don't have to use miniatures for Mantic. Mantic actually is okay if you don't use their own miniatures. They obviously encourage you to use their miniatures because they are a miniature gaming company, but they actually put out rules for armies that they don't have miniatures for, which you may have from other games. Yeah, which is quite unique in the sense because usually miniature companies come up with rules for models they have. Yeah,
Yes.
but for Mantic, it's the other way around. Like for example, one of the factions is called Kingdoms of Men. So Kingdoms of Men is basically a faction where you can use historical miniatures or any human miniatures. So they have said that they will not make Kingdoms of Men models since there is a huge market of historical miniatures out there. So you can use your Romans, can use your historical medieval English soldiers. You can use Vikings. So it's pretty open-ended like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic because I think many of us who have been playing games for a while, we just have like these big hordes of miniatures that we may not actually be using.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the big draws for this game.
Definitely.
Really, is the ability to recycle kind of almost your historical, your fantasy miniatures.
And the rules are free, so it doesn't cost a penny for you to start playing.
Ah, that's interesting.
The core rules are free.
Yeah, because they of course do have the starter sets as well as the PDF rulebooks and the physical rulebooks as well.
Yes.
But that's very good.
This is the big rulebook that they have.
Yep.
Yeah. So the cool thing about Kings of War is in the rulebook it has all the army lists inside. The 14 core factions. So you don't have to pick up an army book or codex for each faction that you purchase. It's usually like a bunch of them in one book. So there's less books to bring around.
Yeah, which is good because some games you end up carrying 6 books to play one army. So what I will do later on is, of course, I will insert the links to all of the free stuff and whatnot below as well. So that people who are interested can actually go and click around and take a look at the game. So how did you actually get introduced to the game? Like, how did you come across it? You mentioned you started in 2016, but how did you get involved in it?
Okay, so basically there was a fantasy community in Singapore. We were all playing 8th edition at that time, and it was actually quite competitive. We actually had a team that would compete and train to actually compete in a competition overseas, the tournament overseas called ETC, European Team Championship. So for people who might not know, it's held every year in Europe where people from 60, 70 countries all around the world gather to play Warhammer Fantasy Battles. So we had a team that went over there for a couple of years, and me and a few others, the younger players, were actually training to hopefully one day join them and play in that tournament overseas. So it was Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, but they had COM rules. So they actually had rules where they actually limited they had restrictions on your army to actually balance the game. Because as we know, games aren't the most balanced for competitive play. So then there came the end times. So end times basically killed off Warhammer Fantasy. So there was no more Warhammer Fantasy after ADAT. It all became Age of Sigmar. So the whole rank and file community worldwide were at a crossroad, whether to continue playing ADAT, play Age of Sigmar, which is the new game that was introduced by Games Workshop to take over Fantasy, or try another game. So at that point of time, Kings of War was coming up with their 2nd edition. We don't know whether it's coincidence or whether Ronnie, the CEO of Mantic Games, had some inside info, but it was a good coincidence that they came out with their 2nd edition, which actually polished up the rules and made it much more complete in a sense. So I was like, why not try Kings of War? So me and a few friends, we tried Kings of War, we liked it, but the game at that time was a bit still in infancy. Like for example, there was only like 7 or 8 factions. They didn't have factions for a lot of the unique fantasy factions such as Beastmen, Lizardmen, Bretonnians, even Chaos Warriors. They didn't have a faction for that. So because of that, there was some of the community who could not find their army in the new game in Kings of War. But me and a few friends stuck with it. So what happened was Mantic actually came out with a book called Uncharted Empire. So Uncharted Empires is basically a book where they came up with lists for armies they do not actually make. So like Skaven, Beastmen, they actually have lists. So they give you the rules, but since you already have the models, you can actually use the models with the rules. And from then on, me and a few friends started playing. We organized tournaments. It was easy sell to people because they already had the models. They just needed a new game system. But obviously, for some people, it's a bit difficult. Like the law isn't as established as Fantasy, for example. Like Fantasy had like 40 years of law, and also the game system was a bit different. So some people initially found it too simple. It's like you don't remove models. So, it's something that takes a while to get used to.
Yeah. It's very slightly jarring, I guess, for people who are used to actually using the models as kind of glorified wound counters, if you think about it.
Yes, they are collectible counters. Like you spend so much time painting them, then you end up actually taking them away from their trays, and the setup takes time, keeping them takes time. It's just Kings of War makes it a lot more faster because all the models you can just put them on one tray. I always like to tell people Kings of War is a skirmish rank and fang game. Because if you think about it, there's only about 10 to 15 elements you control. So you don't control 100 models, you control like 10 or so in a way.
Exactly. And that's also kind of easy. So Kings of War allows this thing called multi-basing, where simply because your models are not counted as individuals within the entire regiment. Therefore, you can kind of just literally glue on some models onto a base. And there's no very strict rule that a unit of, for example, 40 miniatures has to have 40 models on it.
Yes,
so,
which gives you a lot of freedom. You can create a lot of dioramas. I think Professor will actually share some photos of it. Yeah, so it really depends on the individual. But technically, there is a rule called MMC. So this has been a rule of debate, which is basically half of the original model count plus one. So for example, this is my regiment of Brock Riders. As you can see, there's 6 of them. Yeah, but it still looks kind of full on the base. And I actually had some like terrain, so they're actually going over some rocky terrain. So it's a lot easier to just put this down. Okay, this is one unit. So when it dies, it dies. You just remove the unit. So this,
technically those 6 models count as 10 in game?
Yeah, 10 in game, yes. So this is a horde of dwarves. So technically there's supposed to be 40 of them. But as you can see, I've actually replaced some of them with some scenic elements like a crate, a tower, and some like fences. So there's only like 20 dwarves here, but it looks full. So
it does.
The most important rule for multi-basing is make it look cool. Rule of cool always wins. Yeah, it's not you don't put like one guy to represent 40 guys. So that's how my dwarves. So you can see there's only 5 guys. They represent 10, but I've added like a tree and some other elements to actually make it look more full. So these are actually non-Mantic miniatures actually. They're from Avatars of War, a Spanish company.
Yes, the plastic miniatures, right?
Yes.
The plastic regiments.
Yeah, but the ones I showed earlier are all Mantic miniatures.
Yes. So I think, as you mentioned just now, the MMC, the minimum model count, I guess the main thing is that if you put too few models, the base kind of looks a little bit sparse and it's not so visually attractive.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's more about making your regiments look good on the table rather than some sort of rule that, oh, you must have this. If not, I don't allow you to play the game, which is how some people might interpret it.
Yes. I think from my experience, tournament organizers are quite easy with it. I mean, if you're unsure, you can let them know. But usually they just want more people to play, I mean, proxies are pretty much allowed in the game. So as long as your opponent knows exactly what that unit is. If it's a unit of infantry, it's infantry. If it's cavalry, it's cavalry.
And for some people, of course, I think Warhammer 40k is still arguably, it's probably literally the number 1 game. And I've seen people also even use some 40k models for the game. So like, for example, one of my local players, he uses an Octocopter as his winged, right?
Yes.
Goblin winged. So that still happens. I have seen people using Tyranids as Night Stalkers.
Yes, it was very common.
Also kind of fits.
Yeah, it was very common before they actually came up with their Night Stalker range, which is pretty complete and it's one of their best ranges right now for Mantic.
So if let's say, for example, if someone was a little bit interested, right? We've been talking a while about what the game is, how you base things. But in terms of, for example, the gameplay, how would you very easily or directly describe it to someone? How does it feel to actually play the game?
Okay, how it feels is basically, it's very fast. So basically there are 3 phases in the game. You move, you shoot, you fight. Yeah, it's quite straightforward. So it's a you go, I go kind of game. So movement, you do movement. There's no order in the movement. You can go through your own units. You can move. There's no like other games. You have to declare charges before you can move, that kind of thing. But now in Kings of War, it's very flexible. So movement is all one phase. Then the second phase is shooting. Some armies don't even have this phase. Shooting and magic are in the same phase. So magic is basically shooting. So then the last phase is combat. So the unique thing about Kings of War is you only roll dice on your turn. You don't roll dice on your opponent's turn. This can be a bit different for players because a lot of players are used to rolling dice on your opponent's turn. So you do all your actions in your turn, then you hand over to your opponent for the next turn. So a standard game lasts 6 turns. Then the last player will actually get to roll off for the turn 7. So that you never know whether there's a turn 7. So you have to plan if there's a turn 7.
When I started playing Kings of War, I noticed a few things because naturally my brain is going to compare it with old fantasy battles. And the first thing I noticed about, maybe we can go through the phases. So the movement phase, first and foremost, was extremely streamlined. It was very straightforward in a good way. There wasn't any like clunky blocking and problems with positioning. It's very flexible in the sense of allowing you to do a lot of things like charging through the certain types of terrain and whatnot. It's just that there are some penalties involved. You can get hindered and whatnot, but it kind of allows you to do it. Whereas in old fantasy, sometimes depending on the terrain and whatnot, you go into situations where you looked at it, it felt like you should have been able to charge, but you can't because of whatever rule interaction. You don't really have very much of that in Kings of War, which I very much appreciate. The shooting and combat, the way that the attacking and damage is resolved is fairly similar, which is good. There's no separate entire rule set
or table
to
refer to. So basically, if your unit is 4+ to hit, you roll 4+ to hit, which can be modified. And when damaging is actually based on your opponent's defense, so you can actually modify your opponent's defense. So it's to hit, to wound. There's no armor save rolls or ward save rolls. So it really speeds up the gameplay.
Yeah, it's extremely fast. I mean, that day we played, we were just playing around with 1,500 points. The regular game is about 2 to 2,003. But even at 1,005, I think we only took about 45 minutes. It was really, really fast to just go through the entire game. I included setting up the table in that calculation because I actually needed to go off for something, and we had a comfortable game. We weren't rushing, and we still managed to wrap it up pretty fast. So that's very good. The magic phase, as you mentioned just now, of course, a lot of the spells are kind of shooting-ish, but there are also a lot of buff spells, debuff spells, and all that kind of things.
So basically what Kings of War did is they just simplify magic. A magic missile spell is a magic missile spell, no matter what you call it. If it's a 12-inch spell, 24-inch spell, you just roll and you do damage to roll damaging. So they actually, fantasy had a lot of spells. Spell magic in fantasy was almost a different game. In a sense.
But I mean, in fantasy, honestly speaking, even though there were so many spells, I feel like most of us kind of gravitated to the same spells over and over again.
Yes, you would.
Like for me, it was just always Dwellers.
Dwellers Below or Purple Sun, those kind of Uber or Mind Razor. So in Kings of War, the spells they are important, but they don't play such a huge role. There's no spell that will take out half or 1/4 of your opponent's army. It's more of a supporting element. So in Kings of War, the units matter. It's the same with heroes. The heroes at first glance may seem to be a little underwhelming, but they are purely support. So the troops actually do the main bulk of the fighting, which should be the way. In armies, it's an army battle game. The army should be the one fighting.
Exactly. And you mentioned, of course, magic and heroes. So the game has a lot of different types of spells for magic and a lot of different types of abilities, not just for heroes, but for all the different units. And what this means is that depending on how you want to play your army, there's a lot of leeway to mix and match the components which you perceive will help your army direction. I'll probably put a picture of some of the spells, and you can see it's an extremely extensive list of options that you have access to.
And another thing about Kings of War is the special rules for all the units are shared. So there are very few unique army special rules. There are a few, but majority of the rules are all in one list, which is covered in about 2 or 3 pages. So you won't be not in the know about your opponent's. Your opponent has a special ability that only your army has. So you won't be caught off guard. There's few gotcha moments in Kings of War. Like what you see is what you get. It's how you play the game that actually matters.
And one of the things that I found very interesting as well is the fact that, as you mentioned, of course, most of the rules are universal. Even within the game, the stats between the units and the factions very obviously give different units and a different feel, a different style of being used. And the good thing about having universal rules in a sense is that it kind of normalizes the power level. Because if you have certain games where different factions have entirely different stats, because of the variance, you get a lot of imbalance. And I think that's something that Kings of War doesn't suffer from as much. I don't even think if it suffers, like, for example, in your experience, because you play this extremely regularly, even in events and whatnot, would you honestly say that certain factions are definitely better to the extent where if you're not playing some of the top meta factions, you are going to have a bad time in Kings of War?
I would say that some factions are definitely easier and more forgiving to play. But the balance between like the most so-called powerful faction and the weakest faction is very, very small. If you just go and take a look at all tournaments, it's always a different faction winning. What you see is the top players are winning, but they do it with different factions.
That's a good sign. That's a very, very good sign.
Yeah. That's a good sign.
Yeah.
So they are definitely factions that are easier to pilot and more forgiving for a newer player. For example, you play ogres. Ogres are definitely easier for a new player because they are fast, they hit hard, but at the same time they are a bit fragile because their nerve is a bit lower, but they are fast and hit hard. So it's easier for a new player to get started with ogres.
Yeah. Also less models to paint. That's a very big deciding factor for me.
That's always a good point. And the good thing about Kings of War is the army feels like how it should play. Like a dwarf army is slower, tougher, and like ogre army, they hit hard, they hit fast, but there's not many of them in the first place, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, that's true. One of the things that I noticed also, as you mentioned just now, ogres, for example, when I played them, they just basically walked through my opponent's army when he couldn't stop them. Yeah. And that was quite a satisfying feeling because sometimes if you play a model where the rules don't fit how you imagine it, it's a little bit frustrating, I guess.
Yeah, so ogres are in a good place right now in terms of power level to see. I mean, a few tournaments they have done well. They don't have the high nerf because they are in their hordes are smaller. It's a smaller footprint, but their nerf is not so high. So even though they might be very tough, they can break eventually.
They can. Yeah. And for those of you who really enjoy like highly tactical games, I think Kings of War is a very good choice. So for example, as Gaddafi was mentioning, if you know that your unit has very low nerf, then you're going to have to kind of, when you're building your army, you have to protect it. You have to keep that in mind. And the game has very few random elements compared to some other games. So when you're moving your units around, when you're figuring out which units of your opponents to attack and whatnot, it feels almost, I don't want to say it feels like chess. That's such a horrible way of saying things, but it feels extremely tactical, right? I'm trying to think of the best way of describing this. It rewards good play and good generalship.
Yes. I would say the comparison to chess is quite apt because it's basically a lot of trading pieces. It's very rare in Kings of War that one army completely destroys the other army.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
It's a lot of trading pieces back and forth to achieve the objective that you want to win. And in chess, no one wins with all their pawns and knights and whatnot. You would lose some units. So that is the way Kings of War. I mean, war is brutal.
Yeah, and shooting and magic is not excessively overpowered, so you're not going to lose your entire army in the first 2 turns to shooting or magic.
Definitely. The shooting and magic, as I mentioned, is more of a complementary supporting piece. It can help your army. Like it can whittle down a few wounds that will help you when you actually get to combat. So a mixed arms approach is still the best way to play Kings of War. There are skill lists, but they will suffer. It's a big of rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, and so the vast majority of the game is basically a game about positioning. For those people who enjoy positioning, making sure that you get your flanks and your rears and doing all that kind of stuff, I think Kings of War is a very good game to get into and try it out.
So in Kings of War, it actually rewards you if you get a flank charge, you actually double your attacks. So a unit with 10 attacks gets 20, a unit with 25 gets 50. So you really need dice, lots of dice for Kings of War. I recommend at least 20 to 30 dice. And if you go in the rear, it's triple attacks. So even a very weak unit of goblins with 7 attacks, once it goes into your rear, it's 21 attacks. That's going to cost pay to any unit.
And the way that all this positioning and stuff works is that even, for example, in my ogre army, I have no flyers because ogres don't have flyers. But I've been able to get flanks, I've been able to get rears because just the way the game plays out, you will get those opportunities if you take them. So that's always very interesting. Because for those who've never played this kind of regimental combat thing, I have a concern that some people think that it's just about us pushing rectangles into each other in a linear fashion. Like across the table, we move until we touch. The game doesn't work that way. It's a lot more tactical than that.
It may seem that way, but because of all the other variables in the game, like different units at different height, and the terrain also comes into play. Terrain is a huge part of Kings of War. How you interact with the terrain, if you are behind the terrain, if you're on top of the terrain, all this actually comes into play, and also the height of the models. There's no true line of sight in Kings of War. Every model has a predetermined height. So an infantry model is, for example, height 2. An ogre is taller, so it's height 3. So an ogre will be able to see over infantry, but the infantry will also be able to see over other infantry to see the ogre. So the height really comes into play in the game when it comes to magic, shooting, even for charging combat. Whether you can actually see the opponent that you want to charge.
Yeah. So if let's say someone was interested at starting the game, how would you recommend they start and pick up the game?
What I recommend is to choose the faction you like. The most important thing is to choose a faction that you can identify with, because you'll be spending tons and tons of time painting them. Yeah, and there are 28 factions in Kings of War, 28 full factions, and I'm talking about each faction has about 20 to 30 unit options. So it's 28 full factions. So there's definitely a faction that you like, from halflings to orcs to humans. There's a couple of human factions, to elves, to dwarves, to redkin. Redkin is in my background photo, and Basilia, which is basically holy humans with angels. So there's definitely a faction that you like, and the models that you like painting, I think. Or if you already have models from previously, you can just translate them over to Kings of War. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, there are some guides out there, of course, that already kind of do a little bit of a briefing on some of the different factions. So I'll put those links down in the description as well for those of you who are interested in looking at it. What about the starter sets and the starter armies that Mantic produces? Because of course, the game is miniature agnostic. You can 3D print your models, you can reuse your old models. But if let's say someone was interested in like picking up Mantic models, what would you recommend?
Okay, there are basically three starter sets right now. So the first one is Shadows in the North. It's Night Stalkers versus Northern Alliance.
Yep.
Two pretty good Mantic factions. Then the second one would be War in the Holes, which is the Redkin versus Goblins. The latest one is actually Pride of the Shire, if I'm not wrong. It's actually Halflings. They are new Halflings versus with Forged Orcs. So all of these starter sets come with about 750 points. And the good thing is they all come with this Gamer Edition rulebook, which is basically all the rules and all the 14 core factions are all in one book. In soft cover, it's very light. All the rules are here, so you can get started right away.
Yep.
So that is where I recommend. Otherwise, you can actually go for something like this. You can go for the army boxes, which is like this.
Yep.
So this is the Halfling Army Box. So this one has about maybe also about 750 to 1,000 points. Or you can go for the Mega Army. The Mega Armies are where the most value is. They come to about 1,500 points. So you can get started with a Mega Army.
Yeah. And for the 2-player starters, for example, this is what I did to get one of my other friends into Kings of War. I told him, look, you pick one of the factions that you find most interesting. He was like, oh, I kind of like Northern Alliance. So I told him, okay, we will get two 2-player starters.
Yes.
And then I will take all the Night Stalkers and you will take all the Northern Alliance. Yep. So I accidentally have Night Stalkers now, which I haven't even I haven't even taken out of the box beyond splitting models, if I'm being honest with you. But yeah, that the things we do to get our friends into the game, right?
Yeah, because the 2-player starter sets are very affordable, especially when they come in the rulebook. Yeah, you come in the rulebook. So that rulebook has the Night Stalker army list. Yes, the rules. So you can have one rulebook. Your friend has one rulebook, and you have a full army.
Exactly. So I look forward to playing against his Northern Alliance. Probably not with my Night Stalkers. Do you think there's anything else that we should mention before I wrap things up?
Yeah, I think we should mention a lot of community resources that's done by the community, because Mantic is still a small company as compared to like Games Workshop, for example. So the community has actually done a fantastic job in coming up with content that will help new players. So one of the websites I recommend any player to go to is Dash 28. Dash 28 has tons of content. They have army reviews, how to start Kings of War, why you should play Kings of War, guides for new players and whatnot. And also there's another website that is up and coming called Tactical Games World. It actually also comes with its own army builder and also some painting guide for Kings of War, which will be quite useful. And also there's a plethora of YouTube channels out there, including your channel, hopefully, that will cover more Kings of War. We also have one of my best friends, Paige Neil. He runs the Newbie Dice channel, which we have a lot of content on there. He has battle reports, he has guides and all whatnot, and also Mastercrafted Gaming. Mastercrafted Gaming was actually run by KoW. He did such a good job that Mantic hired him to run sales in the US, and also there's a couple others. I think a professor will actually share it in the description and the links below.
Yep. Yeah. The community is very, very passionate, but this one you get a lot of replies. Everyone's very engaged. And I also do like that there's so many community resources, free army builders and whatnot. Absolutely fantastic as well.
Yeah,
So
so
yeah.
it's free. You don't have to pay a cent. If you really want to try out the game, you can try it with rectangle cardboard. If you
That's
just want to
true.
try it. Yeah, so that's what some of us do. We actually proxy before we actually commit to buying a unit. You can just try it out. But obviously, do support Mantic. Buy their miniatures, buy their rules if you can, and yeah, have fun.
Yeah, most definitely. Anything else you like to plug?
I'm always happy to chat. I'm on Facebook all the time. You can just drop me a message if anyone's interested to actually find out more about the game. And if any of you do come to Singapore, just let me know. We actually have a local gaming store that supports Mantic games and called Hammer House. That is where we get all our plastic Mantic crack from. And other games as well. They're basically the best stock local gaming store in the region.
Yeah,
So
but by the way, we're not sponsored by anyone. This is just us
no.
being fans. Yeah, just making it to everyone.
Yeah, so basically just supporting them because they actually provide us with an awesome store to play. They bring in Mantic, they bring in other games, they bring in lots of terrain from Geek Gaming Scenic, Stuff World. So all the stuff that you can use to jazz up your bases for Kings of War.
Fantastic. Okay,
Yep.
so thanks so much for your time, Gaddafi. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
My pleasure.
So we'll catch you very soon. I hope to be able to go to Singapore sometime in the not too distant future.
I also would hope to go to KL because just 3 years ago, we actually had a Penang versus Singapore Kings of War tournament.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so 4 of us actually went down to Penang and we had a tournament over there. It was great fun. We won, obviously. Yeah, but it was super fun to actually get to know the folks in Penang. So maybe you can feature them in your next episode.
Yeah, they are also extremely passionate.
Yeah, there's a small group of Penang folks that are passionate. So we actually are considering to actually have a tournament in KL in future. So they can come down to KL, we can go up to KL, and you have a small community in KL that will hopefully grow even more in the future.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you around. Take care, guys. And when you never roll double ones.
Yeah, that's a good wish to have for this game. Thanks.
Yes, thanks.